Seb, is it?
Welcome to The Collective, where every conversation ignites a new perspective. Join us as we delve into the journeys of remarkable individuals, explore the art of growth, resilience, and the power of a shared mission as we strive to be better together.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Gold Mine. We have another fantastic show for you planned out today, and I am excited. You should be too. Make sure you're doing the things like the show, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, do all the good stuff, get your emails when we go live, which is, of course, Wednesdays for The Gold Mine and Fridays for The Collective. If you have any thoughts, questions, comments, anything at all, by all means, put them up on the comment section. We can hit those throughout the show, kind of like this one right here. DL, afternoon, gents. Good to see you. And if you have not yet, make sure you are signed up for the Reinforcement Loop. That is our weekly newsletter. It goes out on Sundays. And these guys are making all kinds of faces in the background, and I love it. Dan C. jumped in here and said, good morning, gentlemen. It's great to see you, Seb, today. I'll pull up my socks and give me an ass to kick today. Brandon Chase jumps in. Hey, guys. Good to see you, Brandon. But yes, if you're not signed into the newsletter, make sure you are. That is the Reinforcement Loop. Get your brain candy every week on Sunday when we do that. Other than that, let's get in. We're going to be talking about tolerance today, and it's going to be an interesting one. So, Seb, how's life down south? How's you enjoying it?
Good. I'm as I was filling you in on, I'm hemorrhaging money in my log house, and I love every minute of it. I wouldn't have it any other way.
I dig it. Sean, how's the mountains?
Wow, that was a trip. Things are better than Seb. That's all I'll say, because I'm not hemorrhaging quite as much money.
It's a good way to look at it. I got to say, if we can all just enjoy ourselves wherever we are, that's really all it's about, right? I love this. So I want to get into tolerance today, and I had some great videos, but they're not working, so we're just going to give her right off the bat. And I have the etymology, so let's pick it apart and we'll break it down from there. Tolerance is defined in the early 15th century: endurance, fortitude, power, or capacity to bear up. And it says in brackets, in the face of pain or hardship, etc. It is from Old French, directly from medieval Latin, etc., etc., etc. But this is the really interesting part of it. As the definition, the original definition is a bearing, supporting, or endurance as a definition. So let's talk about that. Sean, I'm going to hit you first. What do you think?
Well, good job looking up the etymology, because I did not. And so, interestingly enough, I suppose the first thing that comes to my mind is the distinction between tolerance and tolerate. And so, like Seb right now might be tolerating his money hemorrhaging right now. But tolerance, to me, is something that is a little more long-term. And so, funnily enough, just before we came into this podcast, I threw up like a 5-second clip into my stories. I was downstairs in the basement hitting the heavy bag. And all I said was, in the verbiage, the distinction between days and decades of discipline or consistency or tolerance. You can't understand tolerance if you're defining it through the lens of seconds rather than years as context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm tracking. Slav, you got any thoughts?
Unless, of course, you jack up the intensity. I mean, 30 seconds in a gunfight is... it's really interesting, because I'm going to be honest with you. I did not see it that way at all. I didn't even think of that as I was reading the title. I automatically went to social tolerance. I automatically went to the other side of the tolerance spectrum, or not the other side, because they're obviously they can be congruent. But I was thinking more in terms of respect, patience, wisdom application, those types of things. So I went the completely different route with it. So I'm glad that there is an etymology that's linked to a different side of it, so that we can explore both of those, perhaps.
When I first came up with the concept, it was based off a video, and it was saying that you are what you tolerate in your life, is basically what the video said. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. But when I looked up the etymology, I looked up the definition of it, and I was thinking about those are what your supporting pillars are your tolerances, right? What do I accept in my life? And I'm going to rest that all of it on basically that foundation. And so we had this whole discussion, I think in the first year we talked about the pillars of
Resilience.
wisdom. Yeah. And the pillars of resilience. Yeah, thank you. And that was where I started to dive into it in my own head and started going into all kinds of different realms from there. Sean, you got anything else?
It's been bugging me, and so it was the word tolerance, and I was thinking, I was putting temperance together, the temperance movement,
Temperance. Yeah.
and so the I suppose the quick distinction between tolerance and temperance is something that we could play with for an entire podcast. But generally speaking, the temperance movement was designed to make people more aware of tolerance to some degree. And so, there's tons of ways that we could play with that. That's my only thought at this point. Sorry.
No worries. Well, let me get right into this first question then, because I think this is an important thing. We're seeing a lot of, well, we talk about the comfort zone pretty often. So we see a lot of times where we will fall into this realm of being comfortable, whether that is doing hard things or not, because as we've said before, you can get comfortable doing hard things. You just it becomes part of the routine. So how do we recognize the points where perhaps we're tolerating too much? Perhaps we've allowed one of those pillars to kind of wither a little bit, and then from there, what do we do about it? Seb, what do you think?
Wow, that's an interesting one. I mean, some of the first thoughts that I have is, say, on the social side, if we start at sort of moral, what could we call it? Relativism, for example, where now everything goes, that everything is acceptable, even if it undermines truth or justice, for example. That's something that we're seeing with the victimhood society, as I like to call it. The second thing that comes to mind is personal or collective boundary erosions. When we get to a point where it's all about tolerating a one-sided affair, but it's the boundary erosion on our sides, and that can work both ways. It can, I want my boundaries respected to the point where I forget that other people have them, right? Or I want to respect boundaries to the point where it's now self-harming. And that can obviously create boundary erosion, which is never a good thing on either side of the spectrum. And then, of course, something that we're seeing a lot of is when it starts feeding into mediocrity. And so you're asking the question, when do I recognize that this is affecting me nefariously or negatively? Well, if it starts feeding into mediocrity, that there's something going on here, that you've quote unquote let your boundaries shift, so to speak, in relation to what would be acceptable to you in your own context. And I mean it in a variety of different realms. It could be anything. We can take fitness as an example, where you used to have a line here and the line moved back and back and back and back until you're completely, a million miles away from where you originally wanted to be, or from where you needed to be, or from where it would be preferable for you to be. And so, yeah, those are pretty much my thoughts on that, just initially.
I take it. Sean, what do you think?
Love it. So here's a quick thought. The two ends of the spectrum on tolerance are probably intolerant and tolerant. And so tolerant being the far end of, you'll just freaking accept everything. It doesn't matter how onerous it is, doesn't matter how diabolical it is. You're tolerant, and therefore you will accept everything. Intolerant, we'll call it the other polar opposite, is where you'll just not accept anything. Intolerance is where you're kind of hard to get along with, I'll call it. And so Seb had started raising the idea of boundaries and saying no. Setting boundaries is super important. And so being able to say no is actually critical, but it's how you say it. You can say, if someone approaches you and says, I need a hand with something, and you say, no, I don't have time. You can say, sorry, man, I don't have time. Or you can say, no, that'll never happen. That's intolerance. Like, being intolerant to me is saying no in a way that is kind of uncool. But you can say no in kind of a cool way. And I'm using the term cool to make the point. Intolerant has a vibe. Setting boundaries has a different vibe. And it's when you overlay the intolerant vibe on your boundaries that it puts people off. And so what we all should be seeking is to establish our boundaries in a way that aren't intolerant or overly tolerant. As Seb said, there is a balance. But the balance is something that has to be understood by you properly, healthily, setting boundaries to understand what beyond those healthy boundaries becomes intolerance.
Seb, what do you got? You got something.
Oh yeah, diving right
Dive
into,
right in.
diving right into the warrior in the garden, just like that.
Perhaps something you guys have written about, maybe.
We may have. We may. When it comes to boundaries, we could do an entire episode. We could probably do 5 episodes on that. And I think some of the things to consider is that if we're somebody that has historically have had an issue establishing boundaries or have had difficulties establishing boundaries, it's kind of like, I'm going to make a quick analogy here. If you've never found yourself in a true fist fight or in a training environment where you get punched and you have to punch people back, somebody cuts in front of you in the lineup at the bank and you're having an adrenaline dump, and you automatically, your reaction is likely to be a little bit too hard for what just happened, because there is an insecurity there, and therefore there will be an overcompensation. And so what Sean is talking about here in the way to communicate boundaries and communicate is to communicate them early and to communicate them often and do so properly before I find myself in a position where I now have to get the big guns out to try to have my boundaries respected. And so a lot of the relationship defining moment have to do with an incapacity to do that until it's too late. And when it happens, you're sort of overcompensating, and now you're coming out with all guns blazing, and the relationship wither. Because it's not what was said, it's how it was said, as Sean alluded to. One thing I would like to clarify, and we do that in the book in regards to what Sean said earlier about, saying yes or saying no. When we think about boundary setting, we're automatically thinking about saying no. But it's saying no to the wrong things and saying yes to the right things. So it could be one or the other, but it's important to understand that boundaries should exist, and when are we starting to be self-harming in our lack of application of same. And so yes, or intolerant.
I dig this. So I wrote down here something that I think perhaps maybe is the confusion for a lot of people, is that I think we mix up empathy for tolerance, in that what I allow or what I disallow within my life has to come from a sense of like, oh, well, say someone asked me to move, right? Oh, hey, can you help me move on Friday? And I don't have the time. Man, I got the show, I got my other appointments, I got all these things. The empathy of the moment is what is, I think, viewed as supposed tolerance, in that, oh, yeah, I'd love to, and then I'll cancel later, versus in that moment being empathetically like, oh, you got to move that, that's rough, man. I wish I could help, but I can't. And so I think that at least within the greater society, that's where the confusion lies. Does that make sense? Sean, what do you got?
It does make sense. And you've raised a really nice point, but I'm going to try to reframe it so that maybe it makes sense to me and it might make sense to you. So what I think you're talking about is, and I've never read this anywhere, I'm just like proposing it as a theory or whatever. So you can be intolerant, but you can also have empathy. But I think they're two different layers. And so you've got to have empathy as a deeper layer to use as a filter to determine whether you're going to have tolerance. And so when someone approaches you, Chance, and says, hey, man, can you help me move this weekend? Your very first filter isn't, will I tolerate this or not? I think your very first filter will be, do I like this person or not? Are we friends or not? Is this reciprocal or not? Do I love this dude or not? Like there's a pre-filter before toleration or not. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I'm tracking that for sure. That makes perfect sense. And I think it by at least defining those layers within ourselves, then we can start to realize what we will and won't tolerate in the span of our lives.
Well, yeah, but perhaps more importantly, yes, you're right. It's the fundamentalness of it. It is the reasoning for it. And so we may or may not tolerate all kinds of things in our lives, and we may or may not be intolerant for a whole bunch of things in our lives. But the layer underneath that is what drives that tolerance or intolerance. And so that layer is the thing to study, not the tolerance or intolerance. It's your fundamental values, the principles that make you decide these higher levels of decision-making process that you may or may not even be aware of. I'm going to be intolerant in this moment, but you may not even be aware that you're being intolerant. However, preceding that, you were no doubt unaware of the driving forces behind you being intolerant. And it's that emotional pre-layer. Does that make sense to you? That is the study.
Yeah.
It isn't the tolerance or intolerance throughout your life. The study is a deeper study. Cool?
I dig it. Seb, you got anything?
Yeah, I can play with that. I mean, essentially what we're saying here, and I think what we are sometimes perhaps forgetting, is that tolerance has contextuality, and being a tolerant person isn't a thing per se. You may have a majority of things that you tolerate, and there may be some things that you're very intolerant on. And so I think that to make an assumption or a personal assumption, or to assign a label, so to speak, to someone in relation to some action taken or not taken as tolerant or intolerant, really blurs the line of where we should put our foot down. And so this is where, societally, or if we look at it from the collective standpoint, if we assign a label, you're either this or you're intolerant, then anything that goes within the confines of that can be relegated to whatever it is that we've established is now considered intolerance. So there is no room for logical application of the concept. And that is a massive problem. And so it's important to have the emotional filter, fundamentally, empathy, for example. Like, do I like this person, or they need help and it sucks to be moving by themselves? All of the things. What is my tolerance for the workload that I have going on right now? And how much of myself do I need to be given to my family, or, all of those things that need to be considered before you make the right yes or say no to the wrong thing.
I think also in making the right no as well, because what it made me think of is that, I can have empathy and I want to help someone move. Sure. But in that same regard, if they've never had to move themselves, they really don't know what that's like. And I'm kind of robbing them of the opportunity to do it. And it made me think of my kids, in the fact that, like, there's lots of things that I can have empathy for them, and like, oh man, it really sucks that you have to do whatever. But at the same time, I need to give them the opportunity to learn how to do that thing on their own. And so by saying no to the right thing, we also encourage that in others, and maintaining those boundaries and that tolerance, right? What do you think, Sean?
Yeah, I think that universally is a generally accepted statement. However, on a boutique level or person to person, it's got to be adjusted accordingly. And so, your boys as an example, let's say your neighbor comes over and asks, hey, can you help me move this weekend? And you're thinking like, man, this is the 97th move I've made this year, and I just don't have time for it. And so you look at your two sons and you think, this is a great opportunity for these guys to learn about tolerance and intolerance and how to serve the community, and et cetera, et cetera. And you put the boys right into it, and guess what? The couch falls on one of the boys, breaks a leg. And in your, not in your haste, but in your desire to have them understand a larger world around them, you put them in a position where they accepted too much weight, too much burden, too much heat. And so it is our responsibility to, like, put people into these positions where they get to expand their awareness or their capacities or their understanding of who they are, while at the same time being a little cautious, being a little more hedging the bets, as it were. And so it is the dose is the medicine, as the old saying goes. And your boys on that move might only need a spoonful of medicine rather than a bucket full of medicine. And so the individual who's trying to sort of either encourage others or expose others to this delineation between tolerant and intolerant, it still has to be done with a certain sense of granularity or care, because it's a very binary subject when you think about it. I'm going to teach someone how to be tolerant or intolerant. And there's such extremes that, like, you can go all in on either end and actually cause harm. And so there's granularity to the conversation when you're with people who you have time for or care for, etc. Do you know where there's no granularity, though? When you're standing in a coffee shop, you bump someone, they turn around and say, "How intolerant of you." There's no conversation. They just jump to a knee-jerk reaction of, now you're either tolerant or intolerant. There's no granularity in some of our social conversations out either on social media or out in the world. And so I think that's where a lot of the sort of the misunderstanding of this subject is based on. There is no time to deeply talk about the actual subject that we're talking about with the person in the coffee line that we just bumped into. Make sense?
Absolutely. I think that's a sense of your own personal tolerance too, of like, how much time do you have? Because if I bump into the person at the coffee shop and I got time and they got time, then yeah, we can sit down and have that conversation. Or that person might throw a punch at me, in which case there is no time to discuss toleration, right? That becomes a very physical manifestation of it very quickly. I got a quick comment here from Dan C. I want to hit on. He says, "I believe many personal tolerances are an external expression of held core values, and your core values can be reevaluated based on thoughtful introspection of, am I tolerable to myself?" Ooh, that's an interesting thought. Seb, you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, he's absolutely right, and actually that sort of pokes me to finish my idea from earlier, because I realized I moved on just ever so slightly a little too quick. But when I was talking about the contextuality of tolerance, and assuming that I'm either a tolerant person or I'm an intolerant person, really again negates the granularity that Sean is alluding to, because really the key is introspection, and Brownie points to Dan for even using that word, because I mean, that's something that I absolutely think is one of the most fundamental piece of being the person that we need to be and optimizing ourselves. Is all about having the capacity for introspection, and then having some good friends that will call you the blind spots as well. But when I look at myself and I quote unquote label myself tolerant in a certain context, and I just act on the premise that I'm a tolerating individual until this happens, until that happened, until this other person. So right now what we have done is self-assign a label that we are not living up to. And so now we're getting into a sort of we're getting into a scenario of inauthenticity, which creates and can draw intolerance from others or from ourselves in relation to what it is that we should be doing, or how it is that we are doing it. And so, but I wanted to go back a bit on the risk analysis, so to speak, and it's right. It's time pressured a lot of the time. So do we have the time to have the conversation that gives you all of the finite details? If we had the time to have that conversation, will that person even share all those details? So I'll give you an example of this. My schedule might clear up really seriously if the person's dad is dying and their back is screwed. Because there has to be sort of a prioritization of task, as there has to be a prioritization of life in a tactical setting. There has to be a prioritization of task also. And so, yes, some of this is going to be based upon the fundamental relationship between you and the person that you're talking to. But sometimes compassion is stranger. Sometimes it's just you meet somebody is asking for something, and that person, you may or may not have a long history of establish this and that and the other thing, but you may be the person that person sort of, or that you're sending the lifeline to all of a sudden, and you're necessarily not. And we can talk about this in the context of people reaching out for you when they're going through a hard time for whatever reason. They felt a certain level of comfort with doing that. You may not have a very, very close relationship with them, but now you're the person, and I think to a certain extent, if you look at the veteran community, if you look at the wellness community, has anybody never said, like, look, if you don't feel right, or if you're feeling self-harming, you reach out to somebody. But very often that somebody is not me, though, whoever can help you. And so I think that it's important to recognize that having an established relationship with somebody isn't necessarily a sort of it isn't necessarily the anchor that you're gonna attach or your response to, depending on circumstances. And so if there is time to have a deeper conversation to assess the risk in relation to what it is, for example, the kids moving the couch, well, it's on the third floor, right? Like, that's an unacceptable amount of risk for the kids. And so now you can really start playing with what your response is going to be. We really like cookie cutter answers as humans, because that simplifies life and the complexity of it. And our brains really, really like that, because otherwise we can spin our wheels incessantly. And if you have a predisposition for endless wheel spinning, thinking too deep about everything can be extremely debilitating, i.e. completely stopping you from doing anything and create a certain amount of inertia, physically or otherwise. So those are all, I guess, things that, should be considered.
I dig it. I got so many things. I wrote down a bunch of stuff here, and I'm loving it. The interesting thing that that's being brought up on this is having tolerance pressure tested. In that, similar to the issue at the coffee shop, right? Some dude turns around and is upset with the fact that I bumped into him, and at that point in time, that person has very little tolerance for me. I'm not going to tolerate that kind of behavior, so on and so forth, but it puts me in a position to understand what my tolerance is. Because prior to that, as you said, I could say, oh, I'm a super tolerant person, and I could absolutely talk someone down under stress and blah, 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 blah. But until it's pressure tested, you don't. You have no idea. So I think that's a big part of it. But then I wrote down here also understanding the main effort versus the supporting elements. So, I might have a main effort of, I got to run a podcast today, and I got to do my things, and I got to make sure that I'm da. But if my son's school calls and says, hey, you need to come pick up your boy, I'm gonna be like, bye. And I'm gone, right? So all of a sudden, the supporting element that was my kids at school versus now it becomes the main effort. And that happens in the military and police contexts all the time, right? You'll have a supporting element in a position, and the opposition does something else, and all of a sudden that supporting element is now the main effort. Everyone's on them. So I just want to throw those out there and see where that goes. Sean, what do you got?
Well, I think a lot of this is determined by patterns. And so what the case that you just described, you've played it out, you've come up with a solution, we'll call it. Now, tell that story 10 times with a few different variables, and you'll have a different pattern. And that pattern will look different than the story that you just told, because that's what patterns do. They become a representation of a moment or moments. And so as the pattern evolves, or as the understanding of how this is played out on a regular basis consistently, as that evolves, your sense of tolerance moment 10 should be different. And why should it be different? Because you change. And it doesn't mean that you change to the positive or the negative. You change through a pattern. And so let me give you an example. All of the story that you just relayed, well, your school now wants you to go there, and you're picking up your kid, and et cetera. And that's pattern number one. That's number one iteration. 10 iterations, the school has been calling you for nothing, just like the first time. And you show up, and 10th time, you're super frustrated because, like, you're burning gas, you're burning time, you've missed 10 podcasts. Every time you show up, it's for nothing. It's just nonsense. You're just being jerked around. We'll call that the pattern. And so your understanding of tolerance and intolerance from iteration 1 to iteration 10 is then different based on what they've been driving at you. and your misinterpretation of the moment on the first iteration. Someone said, you got to get to school now. Now you're speeding to the school. But if you would have known that you've got to get to the school now because we're not organized and we're kind of screwing you around, we're jerking your chain, and we got some spare time on our hands, and et cetera, et cetera. Like if you know all of that beforehand, you just won't tolerate speeding to school. You will be intolerant of their desire to get you to speed to school. If you understand the pattern, that's what drives the tolerance and intolerance of the pattern. So you got to understand what you're in to best manage it. And if it's your first time ever in a moment of tolerance and intolerance, you don't have much of a pattern to play with. You're kind of guessing, we'll call it. But whichever way you guess, left or right, doesn't much matter. It's what you learn out of that. Moving forward, you then just advance your understanding of the moment through several iterations until you've got your pattern of tolerance and intolerance in this moment. I find this to be an interesting idea. I'm curious as to what you guys think. So, just the other day, I had someone reach into my Instagram direct messages, and he reached in with a very polite and very respectful DM that entered into a conversation of, and I'm going to loosely state it as, I've seen you doing spinning back kicks on the internet. I've got some pro tips for you. Would you like to hear them? And I'm compressing that conversation down into a sound bite. But what's important about what I'm about to say is that how he came into my DMs established my ability to tolerate his advice. And here's why. Because throughout my social media career, we'll call it, I have had thousands of DMs from people that I don't know that explain to me how to ride a bike or how to make coffee or how to take a photo. And they're coming in at a really fundamental level, a basic level, like, hey, have you ever thought about using this kind of pedal? And so, like, it's really rudimentary sort of advice or opinions. And after a while, social media wears me down. And so when someone drops into my DMs, I almost pre-assume that, oh man, here we go. It's someone with tips about how to do a spinning back kick. And I don't even know if they can spinning back kick. Maybe they just watch movies. Sometimes I think that. And it's not because I'm guessing. It's because a pattern has formed over social media for a long time. But this individual, again, came in very respectful, which is kind of uncommon in social media. Social media can be a bit uncourteous, can be a bit impolite. And so when someone comes in setting a stage properly, I can be more properly tolerant. And so the advice was great. I implemented the advice. I'm a big fan of him dropping in and being super polite and super respectful and super courteous so that we could establish a stage, for me at the very least, of tolerance of his advice. Now, is it wrong that when someone drops into my DMs that I have less tolerance than 3 years ago? Maybe. But that's the pattern that I've absorbed over time, and that's sort of my rhythm that I've created based on the reality of social media. So at what point am I supposed to kind of pattern interrupt myself and become way more tolerant against the pattern that I've observed? What do you guys think?
Seb, what do you got?
There's so many things. So once we start patternizing certain behaviors, so for instance, the way that people drop in our DMs, and for me, I think where my tolerance is being a little bit tested is when it has less to do with me and my bettering of myself in the context of what it is that I'm doing, and more with the person establishing a level of subject matter expertise, or and so I will make a loose analogy. When I worked in a certain unit where we did a lot of traveling around the world, there were people that were working really hard to have all these cover stories and things, and because they were supposed to be discreet, and so they would have all these cover stories and everything, and I came to the conclusion that most people just actually didn't care what you do. They just wanted to tell you what they did. And so I always flip that on them, instead of responding and now having a back and forth with the person rolling their eyes as you are speaking, and you establishing having to lie because you're in an operational context, and it's a necessity for the moment. But also what it does is it just shows you that they actually didn't care. And so once you start understanding that, and there's a patternization, then all you can do that is really beneficial is not say anything, and just get them going about what they really are there to tell you, which is fundamentally completely different from what they wanted to do. So I think that in the example that Sean used, he was able to establish through the conversation with this person that was very respectful and everything, that there was more than just a showing off. Like the person even went to an extra length to do something, to prepare, to spend some time, to really invest. And I think that's important for us to test our tolerance and to understand that we need to be tolerant to certain things, especially the fact that we can't throw the baby out the bathwater. And sometimes a person will, get in our DMs and have some legitimate positive intent, and maybe just maybe through the lens of compassion, these guys have gotten a lot out of what Sean has been doing, and this guy's getting a lot out, and he feels like he's not contributing to this quote unquote virtual relationship. And so for him, it may be a way to contribute to what he feels is a heavy contribution or a one-sided affair, as it were. And so, and this is where our tolerance for our own behavior patternizing, and it should be established and different than for us to take something at face value and automatically relegate it to the pattern that we've identified. So we need to be very careful that it doesn't become dogma. And so sometimes we may not have time. And all of the things that we were talking about here, if we're referring to the school scenario earlier, all of those things, or the help the person move, or whatever the case may be, if there is time, if there is enough communication, if there is a bit of a relationship, if there is a will, information available, all of those things, then fact finding is really key to this entire operation. If there is ways to find facts. Now, let me illustrate this in the context of the bank scenario. So imagine that now a person cut in front of you, because for whatever reason. Now you're establishing a certain amount of reason, and generally it's nefarious. That person doesn't care. That person doesn't look around. That person doesn't. You'll assign a reason why that happened. What about that person just received a nasty phone call from their ex, and they're completely off their rocker for a temporary amount of time, and they just completely shut down the world, even though they were looking straight at you? Right? If you knew that, would you react the same way? And so I think that we're really, really quick to take our interpretation of a certain situation as if it absolutely is reality. Think about being caught in traffic. You're being caught in traffic. All of a sudden, you've just established, you could write the person's resume. You know they are, how much they don't care about anybody else, how useless they are as a parent. Like, you've established this pattern of projected behaviors or projected character traits that are what? That are grounded in, perhaps, in reality, or not at all. Like, you could have a completely different person. And so it's really when we start playing with and this is, again, as we seek balance, it really is a shifting proposition. And this is one of the things that we talk about in the Warrior in the Garden, is balance isn't a 50-50 thing, and balance isn't static. Sometimes maybe the best version of balance you'll reach is 75, or freaking 80-20 or whatever, because that in the context is going to be your optimized balance. And how do we how do we maintain relationships? How do we maintain our boundaries? How do we maintain our tolerance, our intolerance for certain things? How do we do that, understanding that there is no one rule fits all? And when does our own tolerance becomes intolerance by way of us not realizing that the scenario is shifted?
I really dig this fact finding concept, because I think, to answer your question, Sean, as well, that's the key, is that when somebody comes in having done the work, having looked you up, having watched your videos, having et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think this happens a lot with social media specifically, is that you see a snippet of someone else's life with no understanding. And I think that's a great allegory to Seb's traffic incident, right? Is that in traffic, I only have one data point to draw on. This car jumped in front of me and they're a jerk, right? So I have the one data point that I've made up, and then I can assign it based, then I can apply my tolerance to that level of incompetence, which is 0. And then that riles me up, and then it sends me down the pathway here. So I think that a lot of it comes down to that fact finding concept of getting more information to then base it on. What do you got, Sean?
I agree. You're 100% right, which is a perfect launching point for what I'm about to say. And so the individual who dropped into my DMs, I've already established that he was super cool about it. And when he shot me the video, when I opened the video on my phone, I was like, whoa, because he was standing there all super legit in his full Taekwondo official uniform. And so I just thought, wow, something's about to pop off. And his explanation and his demonstration and his effort to put into context the precise mechanics that we had been talking about was all there in the video. Now, here's some things that are important to establishing a pattern on someone when it comes to tolerance or intolerance. As Seb said, it's an evolving relationship. The balance is constantly shifting between those two parties reciprocally to some degree. Now, when he showed up and he was wearing his uniform, I thought, oh, he's totally invested in this. He has put time and effort into this thing. And I respect that. Like, if he'd have just rolled off his couch like a bit of a, we'll call it a scrub, and not like respected his time and my time, that would have been a different message. But he showed up respecting his time and his professionalism or his subject matter expertise. He was dressed appropriately. And like, for whatever reason, that just levels things up a little bit in my mind. And so I watched the video, and as soon as I saw it, I thought, I'm going straight down to the heavy bag and I'm going to freaking get after it. And so what did I do? Like, when I got that video, I was wearing a old sweatshirt and my blue tie pants. But I went upstairs and I changed into what I consider my fighting uniform, which was a pair of black Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu pants from Origin USA, and then another black hoodie that I wear that has got no markings on it, that is super stealtherific. And so there I was in my basement, all ninja-fied, doing what he had asked me to, exploring his ideas and respecting his time by shooting a video to send to him, dressed appropriately, while trying to maximize his instruction, maximize his effort into me. I was trying to pay him back. And so, tolerance and intolerance. I've had so much advice over the last 3 years in my social media account that, again, if he would have come in wrong, I would have started to become intolerant of his advice. But because he came in right, I was tolerant of it. But that wasn't just a one and done. It wasn't like he showed up and I thought, oh, he was so nice to me in that first sentence. This is actually what really happened. He asked me politely and very correctly if I was open to some free and advanced advice. And I said, sure, I'm always open to that. What do you think of these? And you know what I did? Because, again, it's the pattern. I sent him about 5 examples of the spinning back kicks and jumping spinning back kicks that I've done just in the last 2 weeks. I just wanted to establish that he actually had seen me do more than just one kick to your point, Chance. He was aware of more than just a glimpse, a singular glimpse into my social media life. So I sent him those videos, and then it was like, pause 2, 3. Now what is he going to think? And so I was establishing that we cannot waste each other's time while you hand me pro tips to a dude that you know nothing about, me. And so as soon as we'd established that, we'll call it credibility, for lack of a better term, now I'm way more tolerant. And like, no one should have to establish their credibility to me. But it's just that I've faced so much non-credibility over the last 3 years, advice from non-credible sources, that my tolerance level is extremely filtered when it comes to advice. Now, is that wrong? I don't think so. I've got boundaries now. In my first year of social media, I had less boundaries. I would accept all kinds of random advice, and I wouldn't implement it into my life, but I would give it the time. I would give them my time to accept this non-valuable advice. So I've had to tighten up my tolerance filter for these initial onsets. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm absolutely tracking. I wrote down here that the environments are now everywhere, because this is the interesting point that I was thinking was pre-internet, that level of advice you would get at a gym. You'd get at a dojo. You would get somewhere that mattered, right? You'd be on the range and somebody would walk over and be like, "Hey man, I did notice that your draw is like a half second slow. Maybe you should do da 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 da." And you'd go, "Oh, okay, cool, let's see it." And you'd be able to just do it right there. Whereas now with social media, that environment is everywhere, but the subject matter experts aren't coming in that environment. So now it's just random information from random people. And I get a lot for podcasting, editing, friggin' networking, all these things like, "Oh, you should do that and you should do these things." And da, da, da. And I'm like, great, cool, thanks, man. Like, I don't need it.
You're right. Now, here's an important distinction about how super cool this guy did it, or more correctly, how he closed the loop on doing things right. So I put up my video last night. He saw it this morning. I'd asked him, "Do you mind if I use your call sign, your Instagram call sign in the post? Like, I won't use it if you don't want me to, but if you're cool with it, I'd like to give you credit." And so he said, "Okay." So his name went up there. Now, as I was asking him that, he was following up with me in my DMs this morning to say, "Wow, I really appreciate how you were moving there. I see how you've done that. That's a big improvement. I really like the direction you're going. If you keep this up another 1,000 repetitions, you're going to be ... And then he sent me a follow-on video from a superhero in the TKD world who was just laser blasting some amazing spinning back kicks. And I just thought, oh, this guy's on it like Donkey Kong. He's invested in me. He is not just like trying to be all up in my grill. He's like trying to help me out legit. And that is kind of uncommon in my world. It is. Like, I have lots of people who hit me up that want to be in my life, but to help me in my life, that is not that typical, if I'm being honest. And so I don't know why that is. Like, I need just as much help as the next man or the next person. And so I really dig that this guy reached out with some pro tips that were legit, that he genuinely wanted me to improve on. As a follow-up, he's now on my team. You know what I'm saying? And so to close the loop, it's not just like trying to be involved in someone's life. It's staying in their life while you're involved in their life.
Seb, what do you got? I know you got so much. You got all the notes.
Well, you this begs to bring the other side of this, which is, how much will you tolerate before you get engaged in something, right? And so let's talk about this for a second, because everything is a matter of perception, right? We're talking about a kick. We're talking about a spinning back kick. Well, go talk to a Muay Thai fighter, go talk to a wrestler, go talk to a boxer, go talk to anybody else, and they'll be like, "Yeah, sure, spinny, right?" And we all know that there's arguments and counter arguments for absolutely everything we do in the martial arts world. What is making him happy, though? I don't care what the kick looks like, he's having fun with it. Man, I don't care. Like, why? It's almost one of those things where we ought to know when a person is, it's really an individual case by case scenario whether or not I will offer any piece of advice to anybody in relation to anything. There is no cookie cutter answer, and there is no, if I see all the people that I see, kicking in a way that's not aligned with what it is I feel or what it is that my training has taught me or what it is, I'm going to jump on there and have that conversation. So again, what we have here is an underpinning or an underlying reason why that person did what they did in the way that they did it. Now, along the way, there's multiple levels and layers of tolerance on both ends, because it's really easy to say, hey, I got some pro tips for you, even if and I'm obviously that's not how it was said, but I'm just making it a bit shorter. I have some pro tips for you on how to do a proper spinning back kick, all of the things. I'm going to send you videos, do X, Y, and Z. Sean is like, actually, I've done spinning back kicks longer than you've been alive. The conversation is shut. Or Sean says, have you watched my videos X, Y, and Z where I'm doing all these kicks? And the guy is like, okay, clearly you don't want to hear it. So so it would be really easy for this whole potentially well-intended situation to devolve, and so it's really a case-by-case basis. But what's important here is there is a very difficult to establish level of mutual respect that's established on account of how the delivery occurred and in what context and all of that stuff. And so again, contextuality of tolerance and intolerance. How did that, Sean, you and I both have, and I'm sure Chance you might have as well, but you and I both have people jump in my DM and be like, so what about, this and that and the other thing? And I'm like, okay, hi, Frank, I'm Seb. What can I do for you? And why would I spend my time doing it? Right. Whereas I've had people get in my DM and be extremely respectful and say, hey, sorry to bother you. I'm this guy, blah, 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 blah. And right away, I'm like, okay, man, I'm going to spend, 7 minutes writing a proper response or sending a video note or whatever the case may be. But I think that my tolerance, as well as Sean alluded to, kind of diminished over time with people not spending the time to do any research. Guy follows me 2 days later, he sends me a question that 1,500 podcasts could have answered for him, but there is no effort, right? And so when it comes to tolerance, we are very quick at and again, it's the same with the concept of boundaries. We're really quick at establishing our own boundaries and our own tolerance, sort of left and right of arc, but we don't necessarily always spend the same time establishing what in our approach may butt against personal boundaries that would then lead into a quote unquote conflict, or even just a lack of communication. And so imagine now, transpose this to relationship, transpose this to your kids, transposes this wherever you want. But as Dan alluded to earlier, that introspective piece, which we always go back to, how is my approach affecting the outcome? Versus why is that person always responding a certain way, or why is that person responded so negatively? And so we are very prone to judgment as humans, and we're prone to judgment because we're prone to insecurities, and we're prone to ego, and we're prone to a variety of other things that are incredibly nefarious. All of those things are intertwined, and as a result of that, this is what comes on the other side. But once we start having the capacity to look inwards and say, even in the context of a conflict with a friend or a girlfriend or whatever the case may be, once we have the capacity to look at ourselves and say, is there in what it is that I said, or how is it that I said it, something that contributed to create the conflict? Now, does that mean that necessarily you are responsible for what happened? Not necessarily. If somebody is as a hair trigger and every time you breathe, they explode on you, there is not much you could do to prevent that from happening, right? Again, but what is important is if there is a bit of a shared responsibility, we can now diffuse a situation. And so what I'm getting at is, let's transpose this back to the taekwondo kicker coming on and doing all the things. Maybe in the first or second exchange, there was an ego flare up on either end of that spectrum, but it was diffused through the proper application.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, there was. There was initially, you're right. Because when he jumped into my DMs, he described basically his lineage and how legit it is. And that's cool. Like, I love when someone establishes what they are and what they've done. But then it's the next sentence. Where does the next sentence go? And so I wasn't sure which way it was going to go. So I stayed pretty neutral and I said, well, I'm always open for pro tips, but here's some kicks that I've done just recently. And I sent those. And then it can branch. And every conversation like this is a branching point. And each party is deciding which way it's going to branch based on how cool or not they are in the moment. And so I tried to stay cool. He definitely stayed cool. And so neutrally, what we did was figure each other out in pretty quick order. Now, here's the funny part, Seb. As you stated, what I said to him was, and his particular precise mechanics, I'd explain to him as, I appreciate that mechanic, and I was playing with that mechanic over 40 years ago, and over the last 40 years, I've been trying to strip that precise mechanic out of my movement pattern so that I remove all telltale signs or poker tells or telegraphic tells of that particular kick. I'm trying to make it happen like magic, like invisibly, like so fast that the person knows nothing about it. That's what I've pursued for 40 years. That's what I explained to him. And as I was typing it, what I was really thinking was, man, I've stripped out the essentials so much that I need to get back to the fundamentals. As I was making my excuses, I was realizing that what a freaking lame excuse. I've drifted from the fundamentals of this kick in my pursuit of the exotic mysticism of the kick. And so I didn't apologize to the dude. That was thoughts in my head. And then what I did say to him was, I'll get into it. But as I was explaining all of that, his response back to me with an LOL was, dude, you've been doing this kick longer than I've been alive. And it's true, but that doesn't make me an SME. That just makes me a dude who's got tens of thousands of that kick that had deviated from the kick so much that I was actually doing a different kick. It wasn't a spinning back kick, it was Sean's kick. And so getting back to the TKD version of spinning back kick, that was awesome for me yesterday. I went downstairs this morning kind of excited to get all old school traditional on it again. I love that, man. I love that someone dropped into my DMs and put across a massive life lesson in a pretty short period of time that I'm stoked about. And I think that if anyone who knows me and actually knows my martial arts background or the body of work that I've worked on for all of these decades, I'm stoked that some rando jumped into my DMs and hit me right between the eyes with the frickin' TKD reality. I think we all should look for those kind of moments throughout our days.
What do you got, Seb?
This brings a very, very applicable strategy in relation to communication when it comes to leadership, for example, or anything really for that matter. Humans, we're prideful creatures and we have fragile egos. And a lot of the times, to prevent somebody from tilting into an ego-driven response, one of the best strategic way to do that is to feed into that ego ever so slightly. And I'm not saying that this is done consciously or that this is done knowingly or that's even recognized, but it does diffuse. It has the potential to diffuse a situation. So, for example, if there is an acknowledgement of the body of work, if there is an acknowledgement of the amount of time that a person has done certain things, if there is a certain level of self-deprecation in the application of our communication technique, now what we have is an increased tolerance from the person that we are talking to, because we've essentially stroked their ego, right? And so now they don't feel devalued, or they don't feel like 40 years of kicks was obsolete. Because the one thing you don't want to do is, and this is, man, this, you could extrapolate this situation to one of the most frustrating situation I've ever seen in my entire life, which is the archaeological world of Egyptology, right? Because for those of you in the know, you know that there are certain people that are massively entrenched in their own version of what happened in Egypt, and that anything that butts against this or presents an alternative hypothesis is immediately shut down on account of the self-preservation of fragile egos. And as a result of that, we don't know probably a hundredth of what we should know about Egypt, and how it all unfolded and how long it's been going on for. And there is plenty of irrefutable evidence to suggest that the history behind Egypt is, not only is it not known, but it is known that it's unknown, and that we have things that we can enact. But the problem is, there are people out there that are so entrenched in their own little ego, and perhaps there's, the conspiracy theorist in me is like, maybe somebody is keeping them there for a reason, so we don't know. But that's neither here or there. It doesn't really matter. But when it comes to strategic application of communication, this is not about inauthenticity, not to be confused with me making stuff up just so that I can have an in with the person. But this is an acknowledgement of a certain level of capacity in relation to what it is that I'm about to engage with. And so I'm not completely devaluing or discounting what the person has done, and therefore their ego flaring up is likely to be less. And then it will allow for a little bit more receptiveness and a little bit more tolerance, as it were. And so I'm just throwing that out there to say, sometimes, you have that boss that's really, really hard to deal with, but that boss has a propensity for ego-driven responses, sometimes having a little bit of acknowledgement to some of the things they've done or said in the past or whatever can be a circumventing mechanism to get something that you are trying to get, because they believe that they're a part of the catalyst as to why you are seeking it in the first place. So there is some strategic application of tolerance.
I saw this great comic once, and then we're going to have to do final thoughts here because we're running out of, we're already over time. But you brought up the thought of conspiracy theories, and the comic was like, I can understand, not believing in every conspiracy theory, but like to say that there are no conspiracies at all anywhere in the world is like, you just think the government's batting 1,000 all the time everywhere. It's like, no, that's not going to happen. Anyway, I did want to touch on this really quickly. Guidelines is really what this comes down to. Tolerance, in the definition I have here, it says, generally tolerance refers to the spirit and toleration to the conduct. So one may show toleration for policy without really having the spirit of tolerance, in that you can get dogmatic in these things that, like, it brought to mind bare minimum standards for the military, right? You need to be able to do 19 push-ups. And if you can do 19 push-ups, then you're good to go. But are you? You're not. You're just over the line. So technically you're within the guidelines as to what you should be able to do. But you're not really believing in the spirit of the guidelines, that's the bare minimum. I mean, we shouldn't really be there. You need to be above that bare minimum, or seeking to be above that bare minimum. So I think that's a piece of that, in that we've said this before on the show many times, give yourself guidelines, but not like hard dogma.
So guidelines is great. Like, what number was that again? 19? How does that relate to tolerance? How much tolerance is that? Is that 19 tolerance?
Mm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, it's easy to put a metric to a static count, 1, 2, 3, or whatever the case is. But tolerance just doesn't have that count. It's got an internal scale if you care to pay attention. It's got a metric if you care to establish it. But you've got to think about it. You've actually got to drop into your state state, this moment, and think about how tolerant am I in this moment. And so if you are in tolerant mood right now, your tolerance, of course, is compromised. But then later this afternoon, you may be in a great mood, and then you're super tolerant. And so tolerance and intolerance, again, is a pattern. It is not a moment. It's a pattern. But you've got to check into the moment to determine your pattern. And so you can be intolerant for the rest of your life if you're a moody goof. But if you're a happy-go-lucky person, chances are you're going to be more tolerant. And so moods, the moment, dictates the pattern.
I am digging that. We could talk about this for another couple hours for sure. But I know that Seb, you got stuff to do, and I got videos to edit, and I'm sure Sean has coffee to make, or at least a bike to ride. But I do want to get some final thoughts on everything that we've talked about so far. But before that, we got one piece of advice. Dan C says, more tactical capris. So you got to get him into you. Any final thoughts? Seb, anything still bubbling in the back of your brain?
I was scared when Sean said I went downstairs and I put my warrior outfit, the one that I performed the best in, and I imagine him coming back in the buff and start throwing roundhouse kick. That would be too much for me to bear. One thing that I think we eventually in another episode could launch into is what you were just referring to in the institutionalization there, Chance, with respect to cognitive tolerance versus emotional tolerance, right? Because ultimately in an organization, obviously you're going to have to set collective tolerant guideline in order to prevent the falling into mediocrity that we were talking about earlier. And so I think this would be a good angle to talk about at some point. But even with that, those still need to be reassessed in contextualize. They can't just be, well, evidently if this is it, then this is the outcome automatically, because there is more to the picture. And so the reevaluation of this and the sort of morphing of it as time goes in relation to, what it is that we're faced with as a reality might change. And if you want a thought about that, just think about the first crew of pepper potting warriors dressed in cat pat that ended up in Afghanistan, right? It didn't take them long to realize, okay, this is guerrilla warfare. This is the color we should be wearing. This is the movements we should be using. And they revamped the whole thing on account of newly found information. And this is the beauty of it, man. You're standing on the shoulders of a giant, just like this Egyptologist that refuses to change, doesn't realize that these historical gaps were identified as a result of his work. So none of this is taken away from him at all. Without his work, they wouldn't have been able to negate whatever it is that the original hypothesis might have been. He should be thrilled that somebody comes on with additional information and fill in the gaps, is what I was getting at earlier. So in terms of tolerance and intolerance, to be aware that research gaps should be identified, and I mean that not in the academic context, it can be in any context, and I should be expecting somebody to find the holes in what is, and that's precisely what these conversations are even all about, to get people to walk away from it and say, I agree with this, I don't agree with this, and I go down my thought process and I create this other world that we could have a conversation on. I just so happen to have the platform, but this is what this life is all about, dialectics and elevating everybody,
I dig it. Sean, what do you got?
Yeah, I love it. So, the thoughts that were bubbling through my head are too many to mention right now at the end. So I'll stick to just two things. One is the distinction between your own personal tolerance versus an institutional tolerance, as was kind of referred to. Maybe I'll give a quick definition of that. In the in the Canadian Armed Forces as a regular infantryman, when I was in that role, the institution had a certain tolerance. And then within special operations, that institution has a certain tolerance. They're two different levels of tolerance. But then as an individual operating within those two institutions, I was morphing, I was evolving, I was adapting to the institutional tolerance. And so at some point, I believe, if you're a person who can evolve within an institution, at some point, your alignment will separate. You'll either be more tolerant or less tolerant than the institution. And so how that impacts your character and how that impacts your life is probably much larger than most people would realize until they spend the time deeply reflecting on that topic at hand. So that is an area that I would love to explore, is the distinction between institutional tolerance and individual tolerance. And
I will. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. And if we can get that on, then the other thing that I think is important to mention is our individual tolerance can be created through an institutional tolerance. But ultimately, I feel that our tolerance is most impacted by our peer group, by our friends, by our acquaintances, by the people we bump into on the daily. Like, can you imagine if you only bumped into 100 people on the sidewalk and all 100 of them sucked? How that would impact your sense of personal tolerance and intolerance? And so I feel it's important to cherry pick your day so that you can increase your tolerance rather than decrease it. So it is a selective sort of life journey on this particular subject, I feel.
I dig it. I would go so far as to say that it is a daily practice, and that you have to add in your data points every day and reassess where those data points are. I had this little conversation with my boys the other day about using math for a third dimension, and how to do equations for those types of things. And I was explaining to them that, you have your x-axis, you have your y-axis, and then you have your z-axis, which gives you your depth. But those are only 3 data points. So you can plot a point in space for sure. But when you start to have multiple data points in that space, and you start to have, you can start creating shapes, you can start creating patterns, you can start creating all these things. And so the more data points you add into your model of life, the better that pattern comes out, so that you can see.
And I suppose if you add the 4th dimension, time, then
there you go.
We really have a very rapidly evolving, or not, depending on how much you think about it, understanding of all of this.
That's the key. You can have a very simple equation, or you can have a very long equation, and it's not. I can't say one is better or worse than the other, but it can lead to some interesting things.
Is there a point of diminishing return, right? Where
there you go.
Yeah, there is. It's called death.
There you go. You've too many data points.
That's the 4th dimension.
That's the 4th dimension. I love it. Other than that, I got nothing. I just want to say thanks, guys. Again, Seb, Sean, it's always great to chat with you guys. We will see y'all next week as we all continue to learn, build, and grow. Chimo.
Thanks everybody for watching and being part of the collective. If this has sparked any thoughts or resonated with you, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us grow and keeps the conversation going. We'll see y'all next time.